and then you also have a personal submission. Do you want to do them together or separately?
Separately. I'll just rearrange my head for the final 5 minutes for the individual one. That's okay.
That's fine.
Thank you very much for granting us the opportunity to present our submission. We'd just like to thank the Council for their support for the Isaac Theatre Royal. I think we're probably in agreement it's fantastic to have the theatre back in the city. And whilst I bring up the Isaac Theatre Royal, I'd also like to acknowledge the Heritage Christchurch Hotel, who have been very good supporters of Heritage Week, and the building they occupy, the old government building, is a superb example of council intervention of retaining a heritage building, and it's making a fantastic contribution to the tourism of Canterbury. The Deputy Mayor, Vicky Buck, will be able to brief the councillors on the process of how the council in Davina managed to save that building. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge the professionalism and dedication of the Christchurch City Council Heritage team, and request the Mayor and Council to communicate to the staff our appreciation of their endeavours. As a side note, we'd like to note that it probably sounds pedantic that the word in the draft LTP, the word is square, is used. We'd like to remind that the Council that its full name is Cathedral Square, and we'd like to request that it be referred to as Cathedral Square. I understand its postal address still is Cathedral Square.
No, it is Cathedral Square. I think that you're referring to a straight takeout from a CCDU document. So they call it the square in the CCDU document. We do not call it the square, but it's lifted. The document's actually lifted. It is Cathedral Square.
Thank you very much for confirming that.
But if I put in, we'll make sure that there's a bracketed reference to the incorrect name that's in the blueprint.
Thank you very much. We'd also acknowledge the Council's communication by pointing out to the residents of Christchurch that heritage protection amounts to 1.1 cent per dollar of rates, which we consider to be very, very good value. I will acknowledge that we're biased. On to more substantial issues. Are we on a 10-minute submission or... I am, yes, right. Thank you very much. We just draw attention to the Council's reduction in heritage funding, protection and policy in 2018 and voice our concern that it's dropped from 4.635 to 2.629. We understand that it is the Council landmark grant that the Council is proposing to drop from funding. We point out that we think this planned reduction of funding is premature. We might point out that there are still a number of buildings, Daresbury House, the Public Trust Building, Harley Chambers, Duncan's Building, and a number of other buildings which are still at risk, which would be suitable for that grant. And we consider the grant would be essential for to help with their retention. Further on, we'd argue that if the Council feels that because of funding, we understand the pressure of funding, the Council still sees fit that it needs to reduce that landmark funding, we would respectfully ask the Council that it increase the heritage incentive funding accordingly upwards to compensate. Because as you imagine, with the heritage incentive funding, if one of those buildings became unrequired, it could substantially consume most of that grant for that year, and there's still ongoing heritage, particularly in the suburbs with the large houses, etc. On page, I draw your attention to page 221, I'm sorry for the mistake, on the Canterbury Museum Special Project Capital Grant. We note that the museum is seeking, it's got a set of money that's been set aside for 3 grants for the museum of approximately $3 million per year, at some total of $19 million. We'd like to submit, before any capital fundings are released to the Canterbury Museum, that the proposed development should have been through a meaningful consultation which should be signed off the Council. We'd like to remind the Council that according to the Environment Court decision and Canterbury Museum Trust Board versus Christchurch City Council, the Museum is bound to consult with the parties to the decision, including the Christchurch Civic Trust. Our reason for this is that we're unclear as to what the money is to be used for. I've talked to the Council Heritage team and they're not aware if it's going to be used for strengthening. And if it is for a redevelopment project, I would like to be in the situation that the consultation had occurred because, if you recall, the last redevelopment project ended up in the courts. And since the Council's pushed for money, it would be a good idea to wait till the process is fully resolved before funds are released, considering that the Council stated that it's got some funding pressures around that period. In addition, we'd also like to fully endorse the allocations of funds for the Christchurch Town Hall rebuild. We consider this as an important civic amenity widely used by the community prior to the quakes. It is an important building. As you will have noticed, the Guardian is listed in its top 10 concert halls of the world. And we consider it crucial to be brought back. We fully endorse the funding for motor rail on the side of the Taki, and we think it's great to have those two heritage buildings back. One thing that we thank the Council for providing of the full costings for the Provincial Council chambers and for our city, so that if you want to make a submission, you can make a meaningful submission. Although we would ask that in the future that the unfunded capital be in a separate document, because it can get a little confusing when the press rings you, as an example, and says this one, you've got to get to the council document to find out which bit. That's a personal experience. We would submit and ask that the restoration of these two buildings be brought forward as soon as is practically possible, and we commend the council for making them weathertight and strengthened so that they can be brought back as a responsible heritage owner. The reason we asked for those particular two buildings is they were very, very successful and the public utilised them. As an example, our city, which most of the councillors will be aware, was very successful as a community exhibition space and also as a public venue. As far as I'm aware, there isn't an equivalent public venue in the central city, so it's another magnet to bring people into the central city for regeneration. The other issue that we draw attention to is that we noticed in the decision-making process in Volume 2, as regards where you came for your decisions on the criteria, you listed heritage as a community and intergenerational. We provided some documentation to ask that the Council consider heritage and character buildings as generators of economic prosperity contributing back to the community than as a cost. We've included some documentation on that one. Donovan Rickmer, we've included on the diagrams, points out on an economic breakdown, he's I suppose you would call him a heritage building economist, of a breakdown of the actual economic returns of heritage to the environment and to the city. As an example, he points out that 6 to 10% of spending on site on heritage tourism is actually on site, the 90% is spent off-ways. Also draw attention to the fact that according to the PowerPoint was presented at a workshop, in Virginia heritage visitors, the heritage visitors visit twice as many places and spend 2 times as much money per trip. So there's real economic benefits in that one.
And could I just mention, folks, that I've just looked at some figures that were part of a submission that Lynn Lockheed and Ian and I made to the Select Committee of Expenditure and Finance 2 years ago at Parliament. And Lynn mentioned to the committee that Rukema had pointed out that if you demolish a 7.5 by 35 metre commercial building, that wipes out the gains made with the recycling of the previous 1,344,000 Coke cans. And that's just on the dumping, the landfill aspect of it. So there's tremendous gains to be made in all sorts of ways by retaining buildings, and especially heritage buildings.
In addition, we've also included an executive summary of a study called Older, Smaller and Better, measuring how character buildings and blocks of influences urban vitality. This is an economic study, cost-benefit analysis done from Washington, San Francisco and Seattle. One of the highlights which we've included there, you may have noticed, is there's more jobs in small businesses in the buildings, more non-chain businesses, startups in those sort of areas, and there's 36.8% more jobs per square foot for those buildings. We've included that. The reason for mentioning particularly the study, apart from the fact that apparently it's a very, very good cost-benefit study, and it also, that particular organisation is also, the Preservation Green Lab is also doing retrofitting buildings for green. We draw attention that it is Seattle and we are a sister city of Seattle. We think it's worthwhile to approach Seattle to see if they're prepared to come out and brief or sponsor the staff to brief in a sister city relationship. Thank you very much for that's curtail for Historic Places Canterbury City.
Could I just mention that we're actually Historic Places Canterbury rather than Historic Places Trust. There's sometimes a bit of confusion between.
Sorry, I thought I said Historic Places Canterbury.
No, I think you said trust actually, but that, just to make it clear for everyone.
Okay. Well, Historic Places Canterbury is what's written down, yes. So it just shows that I'm sicker than I thought. So I apologise for that.
You've had a hard day.
I have no doubt about it in my own mind. So,
thank you.
Has anyone got any questions in the 30 seconds remaining? Len.
Well, thank you. You've provided all sorts of information which we may not have anticipated would be there. My colleague, Councillor Andrew Turner, talks about how in Europe people actually build around heritage buildings. Have you got some sort of measures over social well-being? You talk about community outcomes here, but have you got any kind of information on the contribution that can make?
No, not specific on the studies cited. It's a case of there is a positive feedback and branding within the social welfare and the responses of working within the area. The spaces I've noticed people tend to be more intimate, people tend to communicate more with those, particularly what they call it fine-grained buildings. The other issue too is a sense of social well-being. For those who are aware, one Sunday I watched the crowds outside the Isaac Theatre Hall queued outside the door and almost round the block on Colombo Street. I'm trying to think of a modern building in Christchurch where they queue up to view it. Possibly with a good gallery, yes. I'm trying to think of a commercial building like that within a show, yes.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Mark, if you'd like to stay and have your 5 minutes worth.